She tried to walk past him without a word, but the child in her arms carried a secret powerful enough to shatter 14 months of silence. The fluorescent lights of Manchester Airport buzzed overhead, cold and unyielding, as James Sullivan wheeled his sleek black suitcase through the arrivals hall. Around him, voices rose and fell in a cacophony of greetings. Families reuniting, lovers embracing, taxi drivers holding handwritten signs. But the sound barely touched him. He should have been elated. 6 relentless weeks in Dubai had ended with the signature that changed everything. A £12 million contract to design the region's first eco-luxury housing complex. Sullivan architecture would be splashed across international headlines. He, at 32, was the kind of success story magazines drooled over. And yet, as he moved through the crowd, his chest felt hollow, as though each congratulatory message pinging on his phone only deepened the emptiness. He imagined his flat waiting for him, polished granite counters, shelves lined with awards, a half-empty bottle of whiskey, victory with no one to share it with. The thought pressed down harder than the weight of jet lag. James adjusted his grip on the luggage handle, willing himself to focus on the practical, get the car, go home, sleep for a week. Then, out of the corner of his eye, something caught the light. Copper hair, unmistakable even under the airport's harsh fluorescence. It blazed like a beacon above the crowd. James's steps faltered. Rebecca. Her name slammed into him like a fist. 14 months since he had last seen her, since the night she walked out with her eyes shining with anger and heartbreak. 14 months since he'd told himself ambition had to come first. And here she was, standing by the Costa kiosk, her auburn hair tied back loosely, wearing a simple blue dress that still clung to curve, as he knew as well as his own reflection. But it wasn't the sight of her that made the handle slip from his numb fingers and his suitcase thud to the floor. It was what she carried. A baby. The tiny bundle was wrapped in a soft pink blanket, fists waving in the air like impatient little stars. James's mouth went dry. He couldn't breathe. The child looked maybe 8-9 months old. His mind spun, calculating dates, tracing back time. His pulse hammered, and then, as if sensing his stare, the baby turned. Emerald. The rarest green he had ever known, the same shade that had lived in his grandmother Dorothy's face and had been passed down like a genetic jewel into his own. People always stopped James in his youth to marvel at those eyes, so bright they seemed unreal. And now those same eyes blinked up at him from the baby in Rebecca's arms. James stopped dead. The world around him dissolved into silence. Travelers bustled, announcements echoed overhead, but all he saw were those eyes staring back with innocent curiosity. His heart lurched with recognition, with certainty. "Rebecca!" he called, his voice cracking like he was 17 again, not the polished millionaire he had worked himself into becoming. She turned at the sound. For a split second, color drained from her face. The grip on the baby tightened, her lips parted, then pressed firmly shut, as though holding back a flood. "James," the word fell from her mouth, sharp and breathless. They stood frozen, 2 statues in the middle of the terminal, while the baby gurgled happily, her small fists reaching toward the ceiling lights. Rebecca shifted her bag onto her shoulder and started moving, fast, angling to slip past him. "We need to go," she muttered, her voice tight. "Come on, Emma. Let's find Daddy." James stepped into her path before he even thought about it, his chest tight, every nerve in his body screaming. "Wait." His eyes were locked on the baby, on Emma. The name ripped through him like a bolt of lightning. Rebecca's chin lifted defiantly. "There's nothing to discuss." But James couldn't look away. He saw Rebecca's nose in the child's face, but the Sullivan chin was there too, stubborn and unmistakable. And those eyes, God, those eyes, a mirror of his own. His voice dropped to a whisper, trembling, raw. "How old is she, Rebecca?" For a heartbeat, her composure cracked. Fear, guilt, and love warred across her features before the mask slammed back into place. "That's none of your business." But it was. More than any contract, any accolade, any hollow success he had ever chased. In that instant, James Sullivan knew with terrifying clarity that nothing else in his life mattered. Not Dubai, not architecture, not his empire. The only truth that mattered was swaddled in a pink blanket, staring at him with emerald eyes that bound her to him as surely as blood. Fatherhood. The word thundered inside him, and it was no longer a question. It was the unshakable truth. James's pulse was still pounding in his ears when Rebecca tried to sidestep him again. He moved instinctively, blocking her path, his suitcase forgotten in the middle of the arrivals hall. The air between them thickened with old wounds and unspoken truths. He could feel the tremor in his own voice as he said again, "Rebecca, please, just stop for 1 second." Her arms tightened around the baby, Emma, the name already carved into his bones, and her brown eyes flashed with something raw and unguarded, fear, anger, perhaps even pain. "We don't have time for this," she hissed, the clipped tone of a woman who had rehearsed shutting him out for months. "We're meeting someone." The words should have been ordinary, but they weren't. They were a lifeline she was trying to grab, an exit she was desperate to reach. James swallowed hard, his throat dry. "That little girl." His gaze dropped to Emma, who was now pressing her cheek against Rebecca's shoulder, peeking at him shyly with those uncanny green eyes. "She has my grandmother's eyes. My eyes. You can't tell me that's a coincidence." Rebecca's composure wavered. For a heartbeat, the fierce mother melted into the woman he used to know, the one who had once laughed in his arms, who had dreamed of building a future with him. But then she straightened, her voice sharpening like a blade. "Lots of babies have green eyes." "Not like these," James said, and the conviction in his tone startled even him. "Not this shade. You know it, Rebecca. I know it. You can't hide it from me." The tension drew stares from passers-by. A mother clutching her toddler tugged her child away from the uncomfortable scene. A businessman muttered under his breath as he squeezed past them, but James didn't care. His world had collapsed to a single point, the woman in front of him and the baby she held. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably, torn between fight and flight. "You made your choice, James," she snapped. 14 months ago, you told me a baby would destroy everything you'd worked for. You looked me in the eye and chose your career over us. So don't stand here now acting like you've been robbed. You wanted freedom. Well, congratulations, you got it." The words hit like shrapnel, each syllable slicing through his chest. James staggered under the weight of them, memories flashing like lightning. His voice raised in anger that night, his reckless declaration, her tears glistening as she turned away. Had she really? Had she been carrying the truth even then? "Rebecca," his voice broke, softer now, pleading. "That's not what I meant. I was trying to make sure we were stable before..." Before he could finish, a new voice cut through the chaos. "There you are, love. Sorry I'm late." James turned. A tall, silver-haired man approached, moving with calm authority that silenced the storm for a moment. His suit was modest, his presence commanding, kind eyes, but steel underneath. The kind of man who had weathered storms far greater than this one. Rebecca let out a breath that sounded almost like relief. "Dad?" James's heart dropped. "David Hayes." She turned slightly, shielding Emma as if by instinct, but it was too late. The man's gaze had already locked on James, recognition dawning like a shadow spreading across his features. "Mr. Sullivan," David said, his voice polite but heavy with unspoken judgment. "I've heard a great deal about you." James straightened, instinctively smoothing his jacket though his insides were unraveling. "Mr. Hayes," he managed, forcing steadiness into his tone. "It's an honor to finally meet you." David's handshake was brief, cool, his eyes flickering to Emma before returning to James. In that look, James saw everything. The disappointment of a father, the warning of a protector, the promise of consequences if he hurt them again. Rebecca adjusted Emma in her arms. "We should go," she said quickly. "Emma needs her nap." James's chest constricted. He couldn't let them disappear, not again. "Please," he said, desperation seeping through every word. "Just let me talk to you, 5 minutes. Rebecca, if she's mine, I deserve to know." David's gaze lingered on him, weighing him, dissecting him. Then he spoke quietly, almost too quietly for Rebecca to hear. "She's your daughter, isn't she?" James froze. His heart thundered so loudly he wondered if everyone in the terminal could hear it. Rebecca stiffened, her voice trembling with fury. "Dad!" But David didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on James, piercing and unyielding. "Well, Mr. Sullivan?" he asked. And in that moment, James knew there was no turning back. He could either cling to denial or admit the truth that had detonated inside him the moment Emma's green eyes met his. He drew in a shaky breath, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I think so," he said. "Yes, she's mine." Rebecca's gasp was sharp, angry, but beneath it James caught the flicker of something else, fear perhaps, or the remnants of love she had fought so hard to bury. David's expression softened almost imperceptibly, though his words were edged with gravity. "Then the question is not whether she's yours, Mr. Sullivan. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" The arrivals hall suddenly felt suffocating, the weight of that question pressing down like a verdict. And James realized for the first time in his life that no contract, no deal, no empire could prepare him for the answer. The days after the airport encounter stretched like years. James moved through his penthouse as if it were a mausoleum, haunted by the memory of emerald eyes staring back at him from a child's face. His colleagues called with questions about the Dubai deal, clients emailed congratulations, but he answered none of them. At night, sleep offered no reprieve. His mind replayed Rebecca's voice, sharp with fury, cutting him to the core. You made your choice. But had he? Or had he simply failed to see the choice in front of him until it was too late? On the third evening, as the Manchester skyline glittered like a mockery of triumph, the doorbell rang. Tom Mitchell, his closest friend since university and now a respected family lawyer, stood in the doorway holding a bottle of whiskey. His sharp eyes scanned James's hollow expression, and without waiting for an invitation, he stepped inside. You look like hell, Tom muttered, dropping the whiskey on the counter. Sit, talk. And so James did. Every detail spilled out. The airport, Rebecca's words, David Hayes's cold scrutiny, Emma's green eyes. When he finished, Tom leaned back, his lawyer's mind whirring. You're certain she's yours? Those eyes don't lie, James said, his voice heavy with conviction. They've skipped generations, but when they appear, they're unmistakable. My grandmother Dorothy had them, I have them, and now Emma does. And the timing, it fits. Perfectly. Tom was silent for a moment, then asked, Have you tried speaking to Rebecca directly? James gave a hollow laugh. I've drafted a dozen messages, deleted every one. She made it clear at the airport that she wants nothing to do with me. Tom swirled the whiskey in his glass, his expression thoughtful. Maybe you're asking the wrong person. Rebecca has a sister, doesn't she? Grace? At the mention of her name, James felt a flicker of something. Hope, maybe, or dread. Grace Hayes Chen. She's a nurse at Manchester General. They were always close, if anyone knows the truth. Then start there, Tom said simply. Sometimes the person standing just outside the fire sees more than those trapped in it. The next morning found James in the sterile cafeteria of Manchester General Hospital, nursing a cup of bitter coffee that did nothing to steady his nerves. Every sound, the clatter of trays, the squeak of nurses' shoes, felt amplified. When Grace finally appeared, still in her scrubs after a long shift, her expression shifted from surprise to resignation. She slid into the seat across from him, folding her arms. I wondered when you'd turn up. James swallowed, forcing the words past the tightness in his throat. Grace, I need to know the truth about Emma. Her gaze was steady, unflinching. What truth would that be? That she's your daughter? Or that you weren't there when Rebecca needed you most? The words struck like a whip, but James didn't flinch. I was in Dubai. I didn't know. Grace leaned forward, her voice quiet but sharp. Because you never gave her the chance to tell you. James blinked. What do you mean? She found out she was pregnant the day you broke up. Grace's tone was calm, but each syllable landed like a hammer. She was terrified, but also excited. She came to your flat that night with the test in her purse. She wanted to tell you, to figure it out together. James's heart stuttered, his mind racing back to that night, his anger, his words, his blindness. Grace's voice cut through the memory like glass. But before she could say a word, you launched into your speech about how a baby would destroy everything you'd built. Do you remember that, James? Do you remember telling her that? His stomach churned. That's not what I meant, he whispered. I meant, not yet. I wanted to be ready, to be able to provide. She heard rejection, Grace interrupted, her tone merciless. She heard you say that her joy, her fear, her news was the end of your dreams. So when you left for Dubai 2 weeks later without even discussing it with her, she made her decision. She would face it alone rather than trap you in a life you clearly didn't want. James buried his face in his hands. The image of Rebecca standing in his flat, pregnancy test in her bag, her hope crumbling as his words cut her down. It was unbearable. I didn't know, he choked. God, Grace, I didn't know. For a long moment, there was only the clatter of the cafeteria around them. Then Grace's expression softened, just a fraction. You should have. She needed you, and you weren't there. But Emma is remarkable. James lifted his head, desperate. Tell me about her. Grace hesitated, then relented. She was born March 15th, 3:42 a.m., 8 pounds 2 ounces. Rebecca was in labor for 18 hours. Dad and I were with her. You were in Dubai, celebrating the contract signing. I remember the photos in the papers. The words twisted like a knife. While he toasted his empire, his daughter had taken her first breath. She's brilliant, Grace continued, her voice warming despite herself. She sat up at 5 months, crawled at 6. She has Rebecca's determination, but your intelligence. You can see it in the way she studies things. And those eyes, your eyes, people stop Rebecca in the street to comment on them. They're windows to something bright, James, something rare. James's chest ached with a fierce longing. Her full name? He asked, voice trembling. Grace met his gaze. Emma Rose Hayes Sullivan. Rebecca told everyone it was just Hayes, but legally, she carries your name. James staggered under the revelation as though the ground had shifted beneath him. Rebecca could have erased him. She could have hidden his name forever, but she hadn't. Despite everything, she had left the door open. He gripped the table edge, his voice raw. I would give it all up. Dubai, the contracts, every award, for one chance to hold my daughter, to be the father she deserves. Grace studied him for a long time, her expression caught between skepticism and hope. Would you really? Yes, James said firmly, meeting her gaze with a conviction that burned. Every sleepless night, every fear, every sacrifice. I want it. I don't want to be her biological father. I want to be her real father. Grace leaned back slowly as though weighing his soul. At last, she pulled out her phone. Rebecca won't talk to you directly, but she might listen if the message comes from me. What should I tell her? James drew a shaky breath, his throat tight. Tell her the truth. Tell her everything I just told you. Grace nodded, her fingers moving across her screen. The silence between them was heavy, but different now. Less final, more charged with possibility. For the first time since the airport, James felt a flicker of something dangerous and intoxicating. Hope. James arrived at Charlton Water Park half an hour early, unable to sit still in his penthouse a moment longer. The November air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet leaves and distant rain, but it did nothing to calm the storm inside him. He paced the gravel path overlooking the lake, his hands clammy despite the cold. Every sound, the rustle of branches, the chatter of children playing, felt like an omen. What if Rebecca didn't come? What if she changed her mind, deciding this was all too dangerous, too painful? He sat on a bench and checked his watch for the 10th time. 3:47. Still early. His chest ached with anticipation and dread in equal measure. He replayed Grace's words in his head, clinging to them like a lifeline. Rebecca might listen if the message comes from me. Might. At exactly 4 o'clock, he saw them. Rebecca's auburn hair caught the afternoon light, a muted flame against the gray sky. She pushed a navy blue pram along the winding path, her movements measured, almost cautious. She wore jeans and a simple white sweater, no makeup, her natural beauty sharper for its simplicity. But James's eyes barely registered her. They were locked on the small figure sitting upright in the pram, wide-eyed and curious. Emma. His breath caught. She was more beautiful than he remembered. Chubby cheeks, dark wisps of hair curling at the ends, a pink dress patterned with tiny flowers. She clapped her hands together, babbling at something only she could see. But then, as if pulled by an invisible thread, her gaze shifted and locked on him. Those green eyes. James stood quickly, nerves threatening to undo him. Rebecca stopped a few feet away, her expression guarded. James. Her voice was soft but firm, carrying warning in its edges. Thank you for coming, he said, his own voice thick with emotion. You both look wonderful. Rebecca's lips pressed into a thin line. Emma was excited about her walk today. She hesitated, glancing down at her daughter. I think she somehow knew it was special. James crouched, lowering himself to Emma's level. The world seemed to blur around him as he whispered, Hello, Emma. The baby studied him intently for a long moment, her face serious, as though deciding if he belonged in her world. Then, to both parents' astonishment, her arms lifted toward him with a joyful squeal. Rebecca's eyes widened. She remembers you? James's heart stuttered. May I? He gestured with trembling hands. Rebecca hesitated. For a terrifying second, he thought she would refuse, but then she gave the smallest nod. Be careful with her head. James lifted Emma gently from the pram, and the world shifted. She settled against his chest as though she had always belonged there, one tiny fist gripping his shirt, the other exploring his face with surprising intensity. Her warm weight, her soft breath, the smell of baby shampoo. It was overwhelming, almost holy. James's throat closed. She's perfect, he whispered. Rebecca's expression softened despite herself. She is. For a moment, they both stood in silence, watching Emma babble happily, her small fingers tugging at James's hair. And then Rebecca spoke, her voice quieter, more vulnerable. This doesn't change anything between us. Too much has happened. James met her gaze, his voice steady. I understand, but it changes everything for me. They walked slowly around the lake, Emma perched comfortably in James's arms, pointing at ducks and squeal. Ing with delight. James asked endless questions, her routine, her favorite foods, the stories she liked at bedtime. Rebecca, wary at first, found herself answering, painting the portrait of a child James had missed, but was desperate to know. She's incredibly advanced, James observed when Emma clapped her hands on command. Rebecca's lips twitched with pride. The health visitor says she's in the 95th percentile for cognitive development. She's already trying to pull herself to standing. She can say mama and baba clearly. James's heart clenched. What about Dada? Rebecca's expression tightened. She looked away. She doesn't. I haven't taught her that word. The reminder of his absence hit him like a blow. He swallowed the ache and forced a nod. I understand. I have a lot to make up for. A gust of wind rustled through the trees, scattering leaves across the path. Emma squealed, reaching for the tumbling colors, and James instinctively knelt, letting her grasp one tiny golden leaf in her hand. Rebecca watched, her expression unreadable, as James smiled through tears he couldn't quite contain. By the time the walk ended, Emma was dozing in his arms, her head tucked beneath his chin. James handed her back reluctantly, every fiber of him screaming at the loss. Rebecca placed Emma carefully in the pram and looked at him for a long moment. You were good with her today, she admitted. Better than I expected. James nodded, his voice quiet but fierce. She makes it easy. She's extraordinary. Rebecca hesitated, her hand on the pram handle, her eyes searching his face as though looking for cracks. You sound like a proud father. James met her gaze without flinching. I am a proud father. Something flickered in her eyes. Fear, perhaps, but also the faintest glimmer of trust. She turned away before he could read it fully, pushing the pram toward the car park. James stood rooted to the path, watching them disappear, the echo of Emma's warmth still burning against his chest. For the first time in his life, the path forward was clear. He wasn't going to stop. Not until his daughter knew her father. Not until Rebecca knew he had changed. The sky over Charlton Water Park was heavy with clouds, the kind that threatened rain but held it back just enough to build tension. James had been there since 3:30, pacing the winding path by the lake, the crunch of gravel under his shoes the only rhythm to his pounding heart. He checked his watch again, 3:57. The world had shrunk to these 3 minutes, the ones that would decide whether Rebecca showed up or whether this hope was just another illusion he had conjured to torture himself. At exactly 4 o'clock, movement caught his eye. His breath hitched. Rebecca appeared at the far end of the path, pushing a navy blue pram. She looked almost unreal, the wind catching strands of her auburn hair and sweeping them across her face. She wasn't dressed for confrontation, just for life. A white sweater, jeans, the kind of effortless beauty that had once disarmed him completely. But her stride was purposeful, her posture straight, as if steeling herself for a battle she wasn't sure she wanted to fight. And then there was the child. Emma sat upright in the pram, her eyes scanning the world with restless curiosity. Pink shoes kicked against the blanket, small hands reached out for the air itself as if she might grasp something invisible. When James's eyes met hers, it was as if the earth shifted beneath him. Those emerald eyes, impossibly his, locked on him with the same unblinking focus he remembered from the airport. Rebecca slowed her steps when she saw him, her expression tightening. James? Her voice was steady but too steady, the voice of someone determined not to let emotion seep through the cracks. He swallowed, his throat dry. Thank you for coming. Her hand hovered protectively on the pram handle. This isn't a reconciliation, James. It's not forgiveness. It's a chance for Emma, nothing more. I understand, he said quickly. All I want is to know her. Emma babbled then, a high, musical sound, and reached toward him as though summoning him closer. Rebecca blinked in surprise but said nothing. James crouched slowly until he was at eye level with the pram. Hello, Emma, he whispered, the name trembling in the air like a prayer. Emma studied him for a long, solemn moment. Then, without hesitation, her chubby arms stretched toward him. Rebecca stiffened. She doesn't usually... May I? James's voice cracked. His hands shook as he gestured, terrified of hearing no. Rebecca hesitated, her jaw tightening. For a long heartbeat, it seemed she might refuse. Then, with visible reluctance, she nodded once. Be careful with her head. James lifted Emma from the pram as if she were made of glass. The moment her small body settled against his chest, something inside him snapped free. She fit there perfectly, one hand gripping his shirt with startling strength, the other reaching curiously for his face. Her skin was warm, her breath soft against his neck, and when her little fingers brushed his cheek, James felt the sting of tears he couldn't hold back. She's perfect, he breathed. Rebecca crossed her arms, trying and failing to disguise the way her expression softened at the sight of them together. "She is," she said quietly, almost reluctantly. Emma babbled happily, tugging at James's collar, testing the texture of his hair, as though cataloging every detail of him. He laughed through the tears, his voice trembling. "She's strong. Look at that grip, stubborn already." "She gets that from her father," Rebecca muttered before she could stop herself. The words hung in the air, and James froze, his eyes darting to her. She looked away quickly, pretending to adjust the pram strap. They began to walk along the lake path, Emma perched proudly in James's arms. Ducks glided across the water, and Emma squealed with delight, clapping her tiny hands. James leaned closer. "You like the ducks, don't you, my darling girl?" The words slipped out unguarded, instinctive. Rebecca's gaze flicked toward him sharp. "Don't," she said. "Don't start calling her yours like you've been here all along." James stopped, his jaw tightening. "Rebecca, look at her. She is mine, not just because of the eyes, not just because of biology, because I feel it, right here." He pressed his hand to his chest, his voice breaking. "Every time she laughs, every sound she makes, it hits me like I've been waiting my whole life for it." Rebecca said nothing, but her grip on the pram handle whitened, as if bracing herself against emotions she didn't want to feel. They walked in silence for a while, James asking questions about Emma's favorite foods, her bedtime routine, her toys. Rebecca answered reluctantly at first, then with the quiet rhythm of a mother who couldn't help but share her child's world. He learned Emma loved mashed sweet potato, hated peas, adored splashing in the bath, and always demanded the same lullaby before sleep. Each detail was a blade, painful because he had missed it, powerful because he was being allowed into it now. At one point, Emma clapped her hands again, her green eyes shining. James grinned. "She's advanced, isn't she?" Rebecca's lips twitched with pride. "The health visitor says she's in the 95th percentile for development. She's already trying to pull herself up, and she says Mama and Baba clearly." James's chest ached. "What about Da? Rebecca's expression hardened. "No, she doesn't." It was a knife twist, deliberate, a punishment he knew he deserved. He nodded slowly, the words heavy. "Then I'll earn it." Rebecca looked at him sharply as though searching for cracks, for weakness. "Words are easy, James. You always had the right words, but Emma doesn't need promises. She needs presence. She needs someone who won't vanish when it gets hard." James stopped walking. His grip on Emma tightened protectively. "Then I'll show you. Every day. No vanishing, no excuses. Not anymore." A gust of wind tore across the water, sending leaves swirling around them. Emma squealed and reached out for one, her laughter ringing like a bell. James knelt, letting her grab a golden leaf in her tiny hand, watching her marvel at it with the seriousness of a scientist. Rebecca watched too, her expression softening before she forced her walls back up. By the time they returned to the car park, Emma was dozing against James's chest, her tiny breaths warm against his collarbone. Handing her back to Rebecca felt like tearing his own heart out. He kissed her soft hair before letting go, his voice cracking. "Good night, my darling girl." Rebecca secured Emma in the pram and looked at him for a long, unreadable moment. "You did better than I expected today," she said finally. James managed a small, broken smile. "She makes it easy. She's extraordinary." Rebecca's gaze flickered with something he couldn't name. Fear, maybe, or hope. "Don't disappoint her, James. Because if you do, I swear I won't forgive you." Then she turned, pushing the pram toward her car. James stood rooted to the spot, watching until they disappeared around the bend, the ache in his chest almost unbearable. But beneath the ache, something else had taken root. Not just longing, not just regret. Resolve. He wasn't going to stop. He wasn't going to vanish. Not a gain. For the first time in his life, James Sullivan understood the kind of fight worth losing everything else for. The November sky had darkened into a slate-gray curtain when James's phone rang. He was in his office, reviewing architectural sketches for a new eco-housing project, but his focus had been drifting all afternoon. The screen lit with Rebecca's name, and his heart jolted. He answered immediately, smiling despite himself. "Rebecca," he began. Her voice cut him like glass. "James," tight, rushed, trembling. "I'm at the hospital. Emma, she's struggling to breathe." For a moment, the world tilted. His pen slipped from his hand. "What? Where?" "Manchester Children's." Rebecca's words tumbled, uneven. "They said pneumonia. She's on oxygen. James, I don't..." Her voice cracked, shattering the last of his composure. "I'm on my way. he said, already grabbing his coat. "Stay with me on the phone. Don't hang up." The 15-minute drive stretched into eternity. Rain lashed against his windshield, traffic lights bled red across the wet streets, and his pulse hammered louder than the wipers. He kept her on the line, listening to her ragged breathing, to the muffled cries of Emma in the background. Each sound was a knife twisting deeper. By the time he sprinted through the pediatric ward's sterile white doors, he was drenched, breathless, desperate. Rebecca stood outside room 7, her arms wrapped around herself like armor. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen with tears, her composure shredded. "Where is she?" he demanded. Rebecca pointed with a trembling hand. "Inside. They're running tests." Her voice cracked and she folded into herself. James didn't think. He pulled her into his arms. At first she resisted, stiff and trembling, but then her walls crumbled and she collapsed against him, sobs shaking her shoulders. "I should have brought her sooner," she gasped. "I thought it was just a cold. God, James, I should have known." "Hey." He cupped the back of her head, his own throat raw. "Gee, this isn't your fault. You're an amazing mother. She's strong. She'll fight this, and I'll fight with her." The door creaked open and Dr. Patricia Williams, the attending pediatrician, stepped into the hall with a clipboard. "Are you both parents?" she asked briskly. "Yes," James said instantly. Rebecca didn't correct him. Dr. Williams nodded. "Emma has pneumonia in her left lung. The good news is we've caught it early. With oxygen therapy and antibiotics, she should recover, but we'll need to keep her here for at least 72 hours for observation." James didn't hesitate. "Whatever she needs. Cost isn't a factor. Keep her safe." Inside the room, Emma looked impossibly small in the hospital crib. Wires snaked from her tiny body, the oxygen mask covering half her face. Her breaths were ragged, each one sounding like a struggle against the world itself. James's chest caved at the sight. He took her hand, so small, so fragile, and whispered, "Daddy's here, my darling girl. I won't leave you." For 3 days, James lived in that room. He sent Tom instructions to handle all his business affairs, ignoring calls from Dubai, ignoring everything but Emma's monitors. He slept in a chair beside her crib, ate nothing but vending machine sandwiches, and learned to read the subtle changes in her vital signs as if they were a new language. He was there when nurses adjusted her IV, when Emma whimpered in the night, when Rebecca finally slept in exhaustion with her head on his shoulder. The second night, Rebecca stirred awake, blinking at him through swollen eyes. Her gaze lingered on his disheveled state, jeans wrinkled, hair messy, dark circles beneath his eyes. This was not the James she had known, the immaculate architect, the untouchable millionaire. This was a man stripped bare, clinging to his daughter's hand like it was the only thing tethering him to earth. "You didn't have to stay," she whispered. "Yes, I did." His eyes never left Emma's face. "She's my daughter. This is where I belong." Rebecca swallowed hard, her voice trembling. "The James I knew would have hired a private nurse and gone back to work." At that, he finally looked at her. His green eyes, bloodshot but fierce, pinned her. "The James you knew was a fool who thought success meant buildings and awards. This James knows success is measured in tiny breaths, in holding your daughter's hand through the night, in never walking away again." The silence between them was charged, fragile, but something in Rebecca's expression cracked. Her defenses faltered as she whispered, "James, I can't go through losing you again." "You won't." His hand found hers, their fingers entwining unconsciously. "I love you, Rebecca. I never stopped. Losing you was the greatest mistake of my life, but losing her," his voice broke, "would destroy me completely." Before she could answer, a small voice rose from the crib, weak, muffled by the oxygen mask, but unmistakable. "Dada." The word froze the room. James turned, his heart stopping. "Did she?" Emma's green eyes fluttered open, locking on his. Her tiny hand reached out, trembling, and she repeated it, clearer this time. "Dada." Tears blurred his vision. He clasped her hand gently, pressing his forehead to it. "Hello, my darling girl," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Daddy's here. Daddy's always going to be here." Rebecca's sobs broke into a laugh, her hand covering her mouth. She stared at the man holding their daughter's hand, the man who had once chosen ambition over them, now transformed. She knew in that moment that Emma had chosen too. And Rebecca, for the first time in months, let herself believe. 6 months later, James Sullivan's penthouse no longer looked like the minimalist shrine to ambition it once had. The clean lines of designer furniture remained, but now pink balloons floated near the ceiling. Streamers crisscrossed the walls, and the scent of vanilla frosting clung to the air. Where there had once been silence and the occasional clink of whiskey in a glass, there was now the babble of children, the hum of conversation, and the shrieks of laughter from a very excitable 1-year-old in a frilly pink dress. Emma's first birthday. Family and friends filled the space. Rebecca's father, David Hayes, watching his granddaughter with the indulgent smile of a man who had worried too long and could finally breathe. Grace, hovering near the cake with her phone ready to capture every second. Tom Mitchell, whiskey in hand, ribbing James about finally trading blueprints for baby bottles. And in the center of it all was Emma herself, clapping her hands as she toddled between her parents with surprising steadiness, a tiny tiara crooked on her head. James watched her with a reverence he once reserved for skyscrapers and contracts. Every stumble, every laugh, every squeal felt like a miracle. He had spent 6 months restructuring his life, turning down lucrative projects that would drag him away from Manchester, creating boundaries his colleagues didn't understand, but his daughter deserved. And now, as Emma reached for his tie with sticky hands, babbling "dada" to anyone who would listen, he knew he had never been richer in his life. "Speech!" Tom's voice rang out, grinning as he banged a spoon against his glass. The room quieted expectantly. James swallowed, nerves buzzing, then scooped Emma into his arms and stood at the head of the room. His daughter clung to him, her green eyes shining, and for a moment he simply looked around. At Rebecca by the cake, her smile tentative but real. At the family gathered, at the life he had almost lost. "A year ago," he began, his voice thick, "I thought I had everything a man could want. Success, recognition, security. But I was wrong. I had nothing, because I didn't have this." He kissed the top of Emma's head as she squealed, making the room chuckle softly. "What I've learned," he continued, "is that being a father isn't about waiting for the perfect time or giving the perfect life. It's about showing up, every day. It's about midnight feedings, dirty diapers, reading the same storybook 50 times just to hear her laugh. It's about realizing that love isn't something you plan for, it just is. And when it comes, you fight for it, with everything." Emma grabbed his tie and stuffed it in her mouth to more laughter. James smiled, then set her gently down to toddle toward Rebecca. His hand trembled slightly as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. The room fell silent. Rebecca froze, her hands flying to her mouth as James lowered himself to one knee. His voice wavered, but his eyes never left hers. "Rebecca Hayes," he said, "you gave me the greatest gift in this world when you gave me Emma. But the gift I want most is the chance to spend the rest of my life proving I'm worthy of both of you. I'm not asking you to marry the man I was. I'm asking you to marry the man Emma has helped me become, the man who knows that true success is measured in bedtime kisses and scraped knees healed, not in contracts or headlines. Will you marry me?" The room actively held its breath. Emma, oblivious to the gravity of the moment, clapped her hands and toddled toward her mother, a small silver locket dangling from her neck. She tugged on it with her chubby fingers until it popped open. The tiny photo inside caught the light, and the room gasped. It was James. A younger James, smiling in the sun, a photo Rebecca must have kept long after she claimed to hate him. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears as she looked down at the locket, then up at James. Her defenses, so carefully constructed, collapsed. She had never truly erased him, not from her heart, not from their daughter's life. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, stronger. "Yes." The room erupted in cheers. James surged forward, slipping the ring onto her trembling finger before pulling her into his arms. Rebecca's tears mingled with his as Emma wrapped her tiny arms around both their legs, sealing them together. Cameras flashed, laughter echoed, and for once, James didn't care about appearances, about perfection. All that mattered was the family in his arms. Later that night, after the guests had gone, the penthouse was quiet again, but it was no longer empty. Rebecca sat curled against James on the terrace, Emma asleep in her crib, the Manchester skyline glittering like a witness to their new beginning. "Do you ever wonder," James murmured, his arm around her, "what would have happened if I hadn't seen you at the airport that day?" Rebecca smiled faintly, leaning into him. "I think we would have found our way eventually. Emma wouldn't have let us stay apart forever. She's been determined since the beginning." James chuckled softly. "Smart girl. She gets that from her mother." "And her stubbornness from her father," Rebecca teased. They laughed together, the sound light and free. For the first time in 14 months, there was no bitterness, no regret, only love and the fragile, unshakable promise of a future built not on blueprints, but on family. Inside, Emma slept peacefully, the locket still around her neck, as if she knew she had been the architect of it all. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new storms to weather, but tonight the Sullivan family was whole, and that, at last, was everything.